I'm really going to have to take that Toronto Maple Leafs piece off of Wikipedia. There's people way too much mileage out of that piece. I can tell you that the Leafs' fortunes have improved dramatically at season's end. We signed 2 Russian free agents named Summeroff and Teoff, and apparently things are going much better now. Folks, meant to get in here earlier in the evening yesterday, and some house business delayed me coming, but 6 hours in a crisp shirt makes all the difference. And I had a notion about a week ago, I think it was, Florence, that in light of the budget being released, and given the persistence with which I attend to the affairs of Thunder Bay, recognizing its regional importance for the Kenora riding, that I would stop in and give business people an update on what our government tabled last week, what it means for us as Canadians, and obviously more specifically and perhaps more particularly what it means for Northwestern Ontarians. But before I get into some prepared remarks, Doug, if you'll indulge me, I just want to take an inventory or canvas, folks. How many people believe it's important that you live within your means? Okay, good. So there, I've talked about the budget. How does that sound? Can I go home now? Folks, this is a balanced budget. It has the hallmarks of a budget that can be distinguished from previous balanced budgets by previous governments, and I'll explain that in a second. But importantly, this budget shifts the opportunity to the individual, to the family, to the senior citizen, and to the small business owner. It keeps money in their pockets that was never for the government anyways. And what taxes are paid are going to important, focused, and strategic benefits for small businesses, for seniors, for families, for veterans, and the likes. Importantly, this budget, unlike previous balanced budgets, has not been at the expense of some of the transfer payments that have been dramatically reduced from previous governments who balanced the budgets. Education and health program spending, to name 2. I can attest to that personally as somebody who graduated from college as a nurse in the late 80s, early 90s, and saw a mass exodus of my colleagues leaving for other parts of the country, most of them leaving for the United States because of some of the most dramatic healthcare budgets cuts known. At the time, that government, of course, had balanced its budgets at the expense of provincial transfer payments. And you don't need to take my word for it. You can take the word of the Premier at the time who said as much. And I think if you Google my friend Mr. Ray, you'll have his clear sentiments on how that wasn't such a good idea. And so, folks, that's not what this budget is about. This budget is a celebration of 7 or 8 years of strategic investment, which included deficit spending, because we believe in our communities. And I believe Northwestern Ontario is perhaps the best example of that. I don't need to go very far here in the city of Thunder Bay, nor do I need to do that in Sioux Lookout or in Kenora. I don't need to do it in Sudbury. I don't need to travel very long before I can see and interact with things that municipal, provincial, federal, and First Nations governments said investing in our communities is the right thing to do now. And that now was in the heart of a recession. And that recession hadn't been seen or experienced to those depths or to that extent in a considerable period of time. So I thought that I would just preempt my remarks about some of the details of this budget with those observations. Because I can tell you that no matter where I am in Northern Ontario, and I've said here a few cities, I'll include Sault Ste. Marie, our priorities have been clear. It has been to participate in an exercise with municipalities and First Nations communities to rebuild, in many cases, rehabilitate, replace, or put new assets in that position that city for the kind of economic success that reflects what its constituent, who it serves, what businesses occupy its boundaries, and in some cases, particularly Thunder Bay and Sioux Lookout, the catchments of communities that it serves as regional hubs. In the darkest days of the recession just years ago, we made a promise. It was simple. It was that once the crisis passed, we would set the course towards balanced budgets. We wouldn't raise taxes to do that. We would control spending, and we would rein in costs. Economic Action Plan 2015 fulfills that promise. Canadians, rest assured that our fiscal house is in order, balancing the budget just as families do, just as you've told me here this morning you do as family people and as business persons. The overall tax burden in Canada right now, as a citizen and as a business person, is at its lowest in 50 years. Now, I don't see a person over 29 in this room, but apparently 50 years ago was the lowest tax period, other than the one we're entering in now, effective last week's budget. Geez, that was a compliment, everybody. Have you not had enough coffee yet? Come around. And as I said before, in balancing these budgets, transfer payments and investments in education and health care have not been cut. In fact, they have been increased because our government understands, particularly in the case of the healthcare system, this is what defines us here at home and how we are defined by other countries around the world. In fact, I was in Houston and New York in the past 2 weeks of my life, and no matter what we were talking about, particularly on natural resources business, conversations inevitably come back to these kinds of institutions that we've become proud of and that Americans identify us by. Folks, these are not at risk. And so now Canada is on a new course. With a balanced budget comes opportunity. And as I said before, this budget is about a shift in that opportunity to the individual, to the family, to the senior citizen, and to the small business person. With a balanced budget, Canadians have more money in their pockets. They can save, they can choose to spend. The important thing is that they can choose, not the government. This is a budget that focuses on creating jobs, growth, and long-term prosperity, born from the decision-making and the capacity of the experts. You and I, as ordinary average Canadians, as business people, and as moms and dads. So let's unpack that. Let's talk a little bit about how this budget will make Canada stronger. The economic fundamentals. From day one, our government has worked relentlessly to get our economic fundamentals right. Lowering taxes, cutting red tape for businesses, and managing Canada's finances prudently. The evidence is clear. Our plan is working. Consider the following points. Canada has demonstrated one of the best economic performances amongst G7 countries during the recovery. Canada recently leapt from 6th place to 2nd in Bloomberg's ranking of the most attractive destinations for business. And according to KPMG, total business tax costs in Canada are now the lowest in the G7, and importantly, 46% lower than in the United States. This is a solid foundation on which we are growing our economy, diversifying our industries and taking our Canadian know-how to international markets. Now that our fiscal house is in order, our new challenge is to ensure that the gains we are seeing are truly long-term and that they are sustainable. We need to stay the course to protect the economic interests of Canada and the security of Canada. This recession, the prices and volatility of oil reminds us that the recovery is still fragile. and to a certain extent unpredictable. And the question is, and I hope that I've begun to answer it, is what can a country do, what can a federal government do to ensure that in the course of recovery, and as we are remaining in difficult economic times globally, certainly some sporadic volatility, that we get the economic fundamentals right, stay the course, and Canada is at or near the top of just about every category that makes it a great place for investment and business. So Budget 2015 and Northern Ontario. Economic Action Plan 2015 will continue to implement measures that support Northern Ontarians, building on our record of support for families by keeping taxes low and helping them save. I want to mention a few key measures that I know are important to people in our region. To encourage small business growth, Economic Action Plan 2015 proposes to reduce the small business tax rate to 9% by 2019. We are increasing the annual contribution limit to tax-free savings accounts to $10,000 effective for 2015 and subsequent years. An average family will receive $6,600 in support per year due to measures we have introduced, including increasing and expanding the universal child care benefit in order to provide every family in Canada with an additional $720 per year per child under the age of 18. We will also introduce tax relief for seniors and persons with disabilities who want to make their homes more accessible, as well as measures to help students pay for their education. On the latter, folks, this is something I heard loud and clear from seniors in my smaller communities in the far reaches of northwestern Ontario. Concerned that accessibility in their home and services would ultimately put them in a position to move to bigger city centres, actually like Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. This was the kind of tax credit that would allow them to do what they wanted to do, and that was to stay in their communities. We are also proposing significant investments and initiatives geared to Northern Ontario's obvious strengths. I'm going to go into them specifically, and you folks, I think, have known me long enough in politics, and many in this room before I got into politics. I don't often imbue my speeches with any political partisanship. But you know a budget is on the right track when you're living in Ontario, in Ottawa or Thunder Bay, and you get a pamphlet at your door celebrating these measures as they are presented in this budget from a member of Parliament who's NDP and is voting against them but thinks that they're a good idea. These are not my words, folks. This is literature that's coming to Canadians in other parts of the country, and from what I understand here, celebrating many of the things that I have just raised. So you don't have to take my word for it on those points. Now let's move more closely into the region and some of the things that are defining or will define our economic prospects in the years to come. The Ring of Fire, a perfect example. I have to say, before I get into my remarks and how the budget pertains to it, I am generally more pleased than I've been that this particular opportunity has been depoliticized. I want to say for the record and how much I appreciate the strong working relationship that I have with Minister Gravel, who understands and has worked with me on some of the important pieces to regional economic development. Things going on in Greenstone that present opportunity regardless of a major extraction site. There may be smaller ones around rare earth elements. For the opportunity to talk frankly for the first time about Northwestern Ontarians' real ability to be physically involved and access to Ring of Fire and some of the opportunities in the region. In particular, isolated and remote First Nations, whom as a federal government we simply just would not see another major extraction site be built without them physically being able to access the site for its economic opportunity. To do what many of us do, and that is to go to work And in some of those communities where there are soaring unemployment opportunities and where we have seen some of the economic activity related to Ring of Fire, and I'm thinking of Webequie First Nations in particular, to be involved in the environmental assessment process, to see elders and young people working through programs, some of them sponsored by FedNor, and others through the environmental assessment process, making significant contributions to the responsible development of Ring of Fire. So this is without question an opportunity to materially improve the economic prospects and quality of life for people in Northern Ontario, and I believe strongly for Northwestern Ontario. That's why I was pleased, obviously, announced with Minister Gravel. It was an invitation that I extended to him because the proponent had applied to FedNor to take a look at a very technical study and plan that would tie in 4 First Nations communities. A road contemplated to be somewhere in the order of about 260 kilometers that would end in Pickle Lake. Pickle Lake, of course, connected to Sioux Lookout to Ignace, and Ignace, of course, to our regional capital, the beautiful Thunder Bay. This made sense. It doesn't discourage proponents who are involved in major and minor extraction activities to look at other corridors, but I believe fundamentally that this was the kind of regional expansion and capacity development that was in keeping with the track that the federal government had been on. And that was that we had already invested $40 million towards its development, including First Nations capacity building to support small business, as well as skills development and training. You remember my colleague and friend, Minister Clement, actually creating a fund specifically for Ring of Fire, for and through the Anishinaabe Development Fund, the First Nations Community Futures Development Corporation. And we've seen incredible results. The investments with Matawa's Post-Secondary Education Authority and Confederation College right here in Thunder Bay saw soaring rates of completion by First Nations people who are now thinking about a job in the resource sector as a result of their training. Completion rates in the order of 80 to 90%, depending on the courses that they take. But as I step back from a Ring of Fire to see where we're at now, we've seen some asset changes or acquisitions, companies pull out, new ones move in. As I've taken a look at the smaller mining opportunities, which would be very important, big opportunities for small towns and cities across the region. I mentioned Greenstone, but I should talk about Atikokan and Dryden and Kenora in the same breath. Of course, we have in Pickle Lake, Placer Dome's facility, Goldcorp's 2 facilities there, and in Red Lake pre-existing, and the other ones that are in and around Red Lake. It struck me that the Ring of Fire in context posed 2 challenges. I've already addressed one of the challenges that I thought were most important to address, and that was to start the conversation and the technical planning for corridors. That one of the barriers for Ring of Fire was its remoteness, and that we needed to start down a path where that remoteness would be dealt with. The second one, folks, and it's not often talked about, it may not be the sexiest of things to do because it goes on in research centers and places where new technologies has been developed. But it's one that I felt very, very strongly about, and that's what we saw in the budget, and a commitment of $23 million over 5 years to actually unlock chromite in the Ring of Fire and rare elements. One of the other key barriers in setting up small but certainly large extractive activities was the separation of chromite and other rare earth elements in extractive exercises. And we believe that through Natural Resource Canada, CanMet, and other technology centers predominantly here in Northern Ontario, that kind of investment is going to do 2 things on this one point. A, it's going to reduce the separation costs associated with these platinum metal groups, and 2, it's going to make it more environmentally friendly to do. And I think that's something, I think those 2 things are important to us all. Of course, I mentioned the regional corridor study, the options for an all-weather road system connecting many of our small municipalities and isolated and remote First Nations communities to Pickle Lake, on down and across to Thunder Bay. Year-round travel that, in my view and in my experience as somebody who's lived and worked for more than 8 years in isolated remote First Nations communities across the country, but predominantly here in northwestern Ontario, a need to reduce transportation costs, provide consistent and dependable access, and open up economic development opportunities that many of these isolated remote First Nations communities were asking for. This is important socio-economic development, regional capacity, to experience the kind of growth and opportunity in and outside of what Ring of Fire and other extractive activities and harvesting activities in the forest sector as it rebounds can pose for our communities as opportunities. So these discussions obviously continue with the province on identifying key projects focused on tangible proposals for infrastructure projects that support economic growth and regional expansion and capacity for stronger communities across the region. We will not be the kind of government that will throw vague and indiscreet amounts like $1 billion without telling taxpayers where that's going and why we're making that investment. So far on the ground, I can tell you that that's been appreciated. Our government's New Build Canada Fund stands ready, is positioned to consider specific transportation and other infrastructure proposals that support resource development and economic opportunity in terms of infrastructure for communities big and small across our vast region. Let me talk now a little bit more explicitly about some of the opportunities in mining that are in this budget, either extended or new. Our Economic Action Plan has introduced or has extended the 15% mineral exploration tax credit for another year and expands, importantly, the definition of the Canadian exploration expense tax deduction so that the cost of community consultations and environmental studies required to obtain an exploration permit are eligible. Taken together, these measures will help mining companies raise much needed financing, boost exploration activity, and reduce the costs. You know, folks, it goes without saying, and rightly so, that community consultation and environmental assessment processes, whether it's for exploration or extraction, are important facets of developing a relationship between a company and a community. And so to the extent that this has become higher profile and has incurred or represents more costs, we thought it was important that companies would have an opportunity to write these expenses off effective this year. Economic Action Plan 2015 also provides $22 million over 5 years to the Targeted Geoscience Initiative to stimulate private sector resource investment and exploration. This initiative has been critical in fostering innovation in mineral exploration, especially for deeply buried deposits. It already has produced significant results that will make a difference right here in Northern Ontario, if it hasn't already, including a new high-resolution gravity survey that's been used to define base metal deposits in the Ring of Fire. I'm going to shift gears into the forest sector. I know there's some folks here from that important sector. Our government remains equally committed to the forest sector, starting with an unprecedented $1.8 billion in new investments in the forest sector since 2007. We are walking lockstep with the industry to transform it. This funding has helped bring innovative products and technologies into the marketplace, promote transformation, and expand markets at home and abroad. To that end, Economic Action Plan 2015 maintains that momentum by investing $86 million over 2 years to further extend the Forestry Innovation Program and the Expanding Market Opportunities Program. This new investment will support ongoing work with partners such as the Ontario Forest Industries Association, OFIA, FPAC, and FB Innovations to drive innovation, accelerate the forest industry's transformation, and ultimately create and sustain jobs in this critical sector. This is an important discussion for us here in northwestern Ontario and across the country. We have seen this sector virtually decimated in the last recession. It went in first, and it's been one of the last sectors to come out, show any signs of real life. I'm pleased to report that despite some challenges, for sure, we are seeing, as a result of strategic investments in innovation and expanding market opportunities, small mills in particular bounce back. Some are reopening their doors, some are starting new. There are at least 3 in my own region out in Kenora that are opening for the first time, or significantly increasing their product diversification and the manner in which they produce those new products and pre-existing ones more efficiently and more effectively. That's what we heard, and that's what we're going to continue to do. And the only thing I can say, particularly on forestry innovation, is that I was disappointed by the uptake in Northern Ontario, frankly, on the forestry innovation program. For structural reasons that I wanted to understand, the first step I took as the Minister of Natural Resources was to actually have NRCan do in-services, I would call them, I guess, as a nurse, but for lack of a better word, conferences with forestry sector people across the region, video teleconferencing, to make sure that they actually understand how the program works and how it might serve their interests. The uptake since then, and we won't see the results until probably the announcements of the new intake, the last intake later on this spring or early summer, as to whether those companies have had some success. But I'm pleased to see their engagement. So, folks, shifting more broadly into responsible resource development, NRCan's mantra. We are focused on delivering a comprehensive plan that has also modernized our regulatory review of major projects to eliminate duplication and provide investors with predictable beginning to end timelines without compromising the important exercise of building public confidence, which includes community engagement, First Nation engagement on both the environmental assessment and, in the case of energy products, the National Energy Board's consultation with community. Economic Action Plan 2015 actually builds on the steps we've taken in that important public confidence exercise to improve rail, marine, and pipeline safety by further improving environmental performance and public engagement. As I've said as recently in Houston and Calgary, if you're in the business, in the extractive business, you are also in the business of environmental performance. And that importantly, when Canadians come to terms or try to come to terms with rail, pipeline, and marine safety, and I'm talking mostly about the transportation of energy infrastructure, energy transportation infrastructure, there are keywords that we can identify. They are consistent, and we are persistent in making them the hallmarks of transportation infrastructure for the resource sector. Safety, prevention, preparedness, response, world-class, if not world-leading, liability, anchored by the principle that polluters pay. This has probably been the most substantive legal exercise I've gone through in a legislature, not just in terms of the pipeline safety that is working its way through the House of Commons. In fact, we voted on it yesterday with some unanimity around these key principles. They are loud and clear in rail and marine safety. I would just close on that particular point, folks, by saying this. Obviously, oil prices have made my job on the energy side of extractive sectors very busy. People are concerned, but suffice it to say, we have said that in addition to building the public confidence by keeping legislation and our environmental assessment processes anchored in the principles that I just spoke about, the other concern I had was specifically around rail. I told our friends in the energy sector who take up a lot of my time, and rightly so. It's important to Canada's GDP, almost 10% of it in fact. That last I checked, forest products, iron ore and grain could not be transported by pipeline. And that rail, well, in a continuing important part of Canada's energy transportation infrastructure, pipelines were and are a solution. I believe overall we're making progress. There will be some decisions in the not too distant future that will attest to that. Other new and significant investments as I close out today's presentation. $135 million to support approvals for resource projects through the Major Project Management Office initiative. $34 million to, over the same time period, to continue with consultations on Canadians for resource projects assessed under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. John, I know you liked that. $80 million over 5 years to support greater engagement with Canadians and enhance safety for environmental performance and protection, as I said, through the National Energy Board. Let's bring it right to home in our local economic development initiative, FedNor, of which I am the minister. Of course, being responsible for FedNor, I know that our future will be built not just on the resources of our land, but on the resourcefulness of our people. Over the years, we have seen our natural advantage here in Northern Ontario lead to growth in research and development, value-added manufacturing in mining and forestry, and the development of new technologies that are now being used around the globe from right here in Northern Ontario. And they are not just in mining and forestry. As I remarked probably a year or so ago, large international conferences are popping up here in Northern Ontario, and they're not just about mining and forestry. They are about things like nuclear technologies, and we had an opportunity to celebrate that a couple of weeks ago. We will continue through FedNor, folks, to foster a transformation and growth through diversification. FedNor is an important part of the catalyst for economic development in Northern Ontario. I've been pleased with its results, and in particular, that given the strength of Minister Gravel and I's relationships, we have been able to pair when and where it's responsible and appropriate funding for various projects. Over the last 12 months alone, FedNor has invested more than $44 million in support of 394 projects. Since 2006, through FedNor's Northern Ontario Development Program, we have invested $343 million in more than 1,645 projects, and that has translated into 21,500 jobs in Northern Ontario. I mentioned the cyclotron development. I would just like to comment that this is a personal achievement for both Joe and I, who Joe obviously making at the time an important political consideration for the presence of that technology here in this region, and from my perspective as a nurse transitioning into politics. I know I was a lawyer, but I simply ask you not to hold that against me. Sorry. Sorry. That I felt Northern Ontario, Western Ontario, and particularly Thunder Bay, could do two things, and it's worth repeating because I mentioned it with some emotion the last time. One, that we could serve our region better, particularly when it came to medical diagnostic capacity. And two, that Northwestern Ontario could compete with anybody, anytime, any place in the world moving forward. Our medical isotopes could be supplied to major American markets, if not around the world. And I think you're going to see that sooner rather than later. Congratulations to Thunder Bay. In Sudbury, of course, we have the Advanced Medical Research Institute of Canada constructing a new 12,000 square foot lab focused on emerging biotech and pharmaceutical research. Of course, the Astrophysics Lab, which I can barely say with a straight face since I was a visitor there and went through some rather humbling exercises to tour that facility. But these projects supported by FedNor, by Science, Technology and Innovation Canada, have been good for Thunder Bay and for Sudbury as hubs for medical research, benefiting all of Northern Ontario. And at the same time, we're working to attract and retain the skilled workers and educated minds to lead the way in economic prosperity. We want the best and the brightest careers and people to come here, but we also want to preserve the best and brightest minds that are from here. And to that extent, FedNor has been involved heartily, I might add, in private sector sponsorship of interns for small businesses, and obviously creating economic development officer opportunities for many of the towns and cities who can't afford an economic development officer. This is so flexible that if a town wants to join with another community, or including First Nations communities, they can hire an EDO to represent all of their interests. And I would say, folks, that that important step reflects the kind of minister who comes from a region made up of many small towns and cities and have understood their economic disadvantage moving forward. So finally, and if in relationship to FedNor, I'm pleased to announce the new Canada 150 Infrastructure Fund. This will actually represent an increase in FedNor's budget, since it will be tasked with working with local municipalities and others to sustain community-based facilities to increase the quality of life of those communities, to rehabilitate, renovate, improve, or expand existing facilities. They include arenas, they include municipal halls, and we're pre-positioning this program, and the details will roll out in the not too distant future, so that these shovel-ready projects can reflect a Canada that at 150 years old has the kind of infrastructure, certainly that all levels of government, but for the federal government's part, won't take a back seat to, that beautify our communities and improve the quality of life. So in conclusion, folks, thank you for allowing me to break this budget down into many of its smaller parts, and I hope make it relevant to you. This is a budget for a generation. This is what this economic action plan has always been about: strategic investments in our communities, creating a low tax environment that does not compromise some of the institutional things that have come to define us in Canada, health and education, to name two. Knowing that smart money has two important features. One, that it's in the pockets of ordinary average Canadians, and that when it comes from government, it is obviously spent on the things that matter and make the difference to communities. We hope that's what you see in this budget, this balanced budget, and I appreciate, as business people here today, as folks interested in the prosperity of Thunder Bay as a city and for the benefit of the region, your important contributions. Many of you I've worked with in the recent past. Thank you for your contributions, and you always know that for my part, my name is Greg Rickford, and I'm the Member of Parliament for the Great Kenora Riding. It's a privilege and an honor to serve my constituents, and in my capacity as the Minister of Natural Resources, the Minister responsible for FedNor, and arguably and hopefully by perception, one of Thunder Bay's biggest fans and supporters, to serve you too. Thank you for this opportunity.